Welcome everyone to Setting the Stage, Boundaries and Belonging. This is our first webinar in our webinar series, When Hospitality and Belonging Becomes Hard, Faith Community Strategies for Responding to Adults with Varying Needs. This is our first session in a 4-part webinar series that explores the challenging aspects of hospitality of people with disabilities in the life of communities of faith. This webinar is brought to you by AAIDD's Religion and Spirituality Interest Network and Stonebelt ARC. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Reverend Sarah McKenney. I am from Stonebelt ARC, and I will be our moderator today. If you will be able to see on your screen a few different websites and web addresses to check out for more information. This webinar is being recorded and will be available in the future on the Religion and Spirituality Interest Network's website. The web address is again on your screen, and it will be sent to you in a follow-up email as well as in PDF format. So let's get started and meet our speakers today. Bill?
Greetings, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Bill Gaventa. I'm a, I don't say retired, I say reframed person who's worked in this arena for a long time and found that the AAIDD Religion and Spirituality Interest Network has probably been one of my major professional homes over time. I'm delighted to be part of this webinar series because I think it's addressing such an important aspect of inclusion in faith communities, and look forward to our conversation today.
Hello, my name is Reverend Amy Petre Hill. It's a pleasure to be here. I haven't been working in this area quite as long as Bill, but I did start as a disability rights lawyer and then felt called to ministry. And now I am the founder of Mental Health and Inclusion Ministries in Colorado, which helped act as a connection between agencies, individuals and families who are getting services who may also want to include connection to a faith community in their life. And I do that in an interfaith way. And so I bring that perspective, as well as my experience as a LEND Spiritual Care Fellow at JFK Partners. I have also found AAIDD to be, and the Religion and Spirituality Group, to be a wonderful place to start and to get support in doing this work. So pleasure to be here.
As I already said, my name is Sarah McKenney. I am the creator of the spiritual support program at Stonebelt ARC, and then act as the spiritual support coordinator for Stonebelt. With that job, I support people with intellectual developmental disabilities in their spiritual needs. So while I am kind of like a chaplain, a little less as maybe a typical chaplain, as I kind of like to say that I'm more of a spiritual case manager, so to speak, in the sense that my goal is that I don't necessarily meet the spiritual needs of a particular person, but instead we look to the community and to build relationships and connections in the community and help to make their spiritual needs be met through various congregations in that individual's community. And so a part of my role is working with a variety of different faith communities on this area of including people with disabilities, and do trainings, talks, and such. So thank you all for having me here.
Greetings, I'm Reverend Dr. Joanne VanSant. I currently pastor a congregation in New Jersey of the Friends to Friends Community Church, which is a congregation of the Reformed Church of America. and primarily of people with developmental, intellectual, neurodiversities in our congregation. We serve people primarily, again, who live in supportive housing and come from a variety of living situations, agencies, and then we also have some families. So it's within ourselves, it's a pretty diverse and wonderful community. I also chaplain at an agency, one of our Friends to Friends participating agencies, but I chaplain at the facility. It is also for people with developmental and intellectual neurodiversities, in supportive housing and all of the case management work and all of those resources that they need to have meaningful lives. And my place in that component is to provide spiritual practice and development and opportunities for not only our residents but our staff. And with our residents, it is similar to Sarah's work in building community connections so that our folks can find places they want to worship and be welcomed into in the community where they live. So I look forward to being a part of this panel this morning, this afternoon, sorry, whatever time it is, and where you are. And let's get started. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. So as you can see, we have come from a variety of ministry contexts in which we have worked both with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and faith communities. As we started brainstorming topics for a spring webinar series, the question of how behavior can impact inclusion in congregations rose quickly to the top. In fact, after about 40 minutes of discussion, we thought this planning session would make a good beginning to a webinar series. So today we are going to try to relive that discussion by starting off with a couple key points each of us wants to make coming from the experiences or stories we have all had. Then we are going to invite you into the discussion, all as a foundation for the next 3 webinars, which will delve into a little more of the different aspects and strategies for supporting people in congregational settings who may not communicate or act in ways customary to a particular congregation. As we start our conversation today, I do want to first clarify our terminology and use of the word behavior. We understand behavior as a form of communication. So our first task is always going to be to try and understand that behavior and try and understand what is trying to be communicated or what is being communicated. Second, is what we have been called or what has been called challenging behavior. This really can be present in a wide variety of people in congregational settings. It is not just confined to some children or adults with intellectual developmental disabilities. So to get us started, I'm going to have Bill kick us off with a few initial thoughts.
Great. As we were talking about this, I shared with the group this quote that's at the top of our webinar series from Fred Craddock, who many of you may not know of, who was a pretty famous professor of homiletics and an excellent preacher. And he was at Princeton Seminary one time giving a talk, and I heard it, and it was not about disability at all, but it was more about belonging and hospitality in communities. And he had that wonderful line, I think, that just because everybody's welcome doesn't mean anything goes. Anything goes. I've often worked with people who have asked about specific situations, and as they worked with trying to include people with disabilities in faith communities. And one of the things that I've seen over time is one of the dangers that I hope we can avoid in this is that I've seen kind of a pattern sometimes when somebody or maybe a few people with intellectual and developmental disabilities first start coming to a faith community, and they have not had, I'll come back to this point in a minute, they really don't know what the kind of behavioral expectations are, or kind of the hidden culture of that community is. Then they perhaps do something different than what everybody else is doing. And that causes some uncertainty and nervousness in other people in the congregation. And if it keeps on going, and if there's any kind of sort of seriousness to it, or in terms of extensiveness, people will get more and more frustrated because they don't know what to do about it, because they think to be good Christian welcomers and hospitality and be hospitable, they have to welcome and accept what people are doing, which is what I would call more of a pity response than a real human response and an adult response. After all, somewhere in Thessalonians that says somewhere we can be careful how we admonish one another. Well, we all, but the key thing there has been, so you don't want to get into this kind of pity, then with the situation that builds up and up and up until boom, something happens and people says, oh, you shouldn't come, or we can't come anymore, or that church wasn't very nice to us, we're leaving. So you get this kind of pity rejection syndrome, and you want to avoid that. And one of the ways I think you first start avoiding that is realizing that boundaries can be used in the service of connection, not to create distance, but to help people connect. Every congregation has what the autism world calls a hidden curriculum about how they expect people in their tradition and in that particular congregation to behave or to act at different points in different kinds of settings within that setting. And if you don't know that, think about the first time maybe you went to a faith community that's much different than your tradition that you grew up with. I'm a Baptist. The first time I went to a Catholic Mass, I really thought I was liturgically challenged. I mean, I did not know what to do, when, and where. And I stood out like a sore thumb. Luckily, I had some nice people who would say, here, this is what you do, and things like that. Now, the question is, can we be aware of that and help make it more explicit for people who have not had the experience or maybe can't catch on just as fast? Which means, how can we, as we help people move into faith communities, as parents, as providers like staff from Sarah's place, or staff from agencies that Amy or Joanne are working with, how can they, as well as the church, understand that part of the task is helping people become familiar with what's going on there? So that might mean, for instance, coming for the first time, not on a Sunday morning or for Friday evening Shabbat service or Saturday Shabbat, but come another time, get the introduction so people know each other. Come, let somebody talk them through what happens in a service in the sanctuary. Let people know where the bathrooms are. Figure out where people might want to sit, because that makes a difference sometimes. So it's becoming just more sensitive to the fact that for us to really be helpful to people in this arena, we have to be hospitable, but we also have to do a lot of teaching in kind of multiple directions to help people begin to move in and be included in ways that where you build a relationship, then if issues come up, you can deal with them and assume that people can learn. That's my 2 cents for the beginning. Amy, you're on.
Bill, that is worth more than 2 cents, I'll just say. But I, of course, agree with everything you're saying, Bill. It's so important. And I'm going to add a little something from the position of the people in the congregation, and maybe how we can grow spiritually, and also in our ability to offer hospitality for people with any kind of difference, cultural difference. They come from another part of the world. And one way we can do that is by becoming aware of maybe our own prejudices or thoughts or unexamined things in our life, and if we might, maybe project on certain people things we've experienced. And I'll give a very concrete example. Before founding Mental Health and Inclusion Ministries, I was an inclusion minister at a congregation, and it was a little bit smaller, and it was wonderful. But as we welcomed in members, actively welcomed in folks who were living with IDD, and these were older adults without families who were living in host home situations. One person in particular, a lovely lady, I'll call her Dana, started to experience some issues. She would feel left out and get very angry and stomp out in the middle of a service if she wasn't allowed to walk up to the stage and sing. And as a faith community, we are not experts in mental health and behavioral health. I have a background in that, but as a congregation, we aren't. So what we had to do is we had to open ourselves up to maybe asking for help and reaching out to folks who might know more. In Colorado, they don't have wonderful people like Sarah working at their agencies, but we were able to reach out to the host home provider of this particular woman, Dana. And what we learned was that this behavior, like many of us who are trying to grow in our emotional intelligence and maturity, was working on this issue of getting angry and leaving, not just in church, but in other parts of her life. And we realized, we all do that. Part of what we do in faith communities is help each other grow. And that's not just for people with IDD, that's for all of us, growing in gratitude, growing in whatever that is. So we realized that we needed to reach out, and we did. And we learned that this person had a behavior plan, and we got some very specific advice on, we're working with this person and you will help them grow and set healthy boundaries for yourself if when she does this, you follow these steps. And it was a challenge for a while, because the steps is to take her out, let her calm down. And if she still wanted to be angry and yell, it was like, well, we're going to need to send you home and you're welcome back next time. But that's what her whole care team said, this is the most helpful thing for her. That was a real challenge for some of our church members. They're like, no, we want to love them and we have to be nice all the time, which is true. We do have to be kind, right? But we were infantilizing this person a little bit. This is an adult. This is a person with a complex life that includes boyfriends, girlfriends, work, day programs, all this stuff. And so we had to walk through that. But when we did, and we all got on the same page, this woman not only had the opportunity to excel at being part of the church, we learned that her behavior, it made it easier for her to succeed in other parts of her life. So to bring that all together, as a congregation, we can be supporting the person, not only in giving them access, but genuine belonging includes helping them excel, as Bill was talking about. And that can mean us being willing to do something a little different to offer what that person needs to succeed. Thank you.
All right, then I will follow up our team. And I probably have some key points that are similar to what's been said. But I really wanted to focus on embracing the individuals and really creating an environment that's warm and open, and one that seeks to guide participation and to provide strong support and relationships to someone so they can feel wanted and they can feel successful in whatever capacity they come to in our congregations. So I wanted to start with a couple of stories. So one is not about the church. It was one of my first experiences with developmentally disabled in an institution. And I had just started working for the Girl Scouts, which was my first part of my career. And we had a Boy Scout volunteer, interestingly enough, who in one of our institutions ran a Brownie Girl Scout troop, a Junior Girl Scout troop, and a Boy Scout troop. So we went, because today was the day the women who were in the Brownie Girl Scout troop were going to become Junior Girl Scouts. And that's a big thing in the Girl Scouts, and it's a big ceremony. And for those of you with Girl Scouts or Girl Guides, you walk across the bridge and you get a pin. So our women were doing that, and they lined up, and we had, you know, the Pledge of Allegiance and all of the pomp and circumstance. They walked across their little bridge and they got their pins. But the most incredible part was one of the women, and she was tall. I just remember she was tall with short hair. She was so thrilled about this experience that she took off all of her clothes. She screamed in joy and she ran out of the room. So what do we do with that kind of surprise? So it was not a big incident. It was a surprise, but it was such great joy. You couldn't deny her joy, and that's how she chose to express it. And so we went about our business. We finished the ceremony. Staff collected her, got her clothes back on, and in she came. But we were able to, and because I was with experienced people, we were all able to just let it ride, and people did what they needed to do to take care of the person. And we were given a firsthand experience of a celebration of great joy in this little Brownie Girl Scout ceremony. The second story I have is about a group home, and they were partnered with a congregation. And the women who were in this group home and participated in this church were all used wheelchairs. Most of them did not use verbal communication, or they didn't have a large verbal communication. And then some of them would, one of the women would unexpectedly scream, and another woman would wail. And her wailing, it was really a sign of worship. It's how she sang. And if the wailing was accompanied with tears, then she had anxiety, and the sound and the stimulation was too much. I know that because the group home now attends Friends to Friends Community Church. But because they attended this church for a short time, the congregation was uncomfortable with all these unusual things that would happen during their worship, and the group home was asked to leave. So that not only hurts the women, it hurts the staff tremendously, because these are the people they care for, and when they are made to feel unwelcome, they are also hurt and angry and suspect to bring their charges, you know, whoever you're in charge of, to church again. The other piece was about a young man, and someone had called me for some advice. And the young man was a member of their church, and he was on the autism spectrum, was part of their Sunday school, but now he had aged out of the Sunday school and he came to worship. And he would sit with his family in a row, but he had a tendency to stare. And so he would stare to the back of the church, he'd stare to his right, he'd stare to his left. The challenge was that the women who sat in around those seats, there were a couple of women who felt, now that he was not a small child, but he was a man, that he was staring at them, and it made them very uncomfortable. And they wanted the Christian ed and the pastors to do something about it. So it did turn out, when we talked about it a little bit, that he actually never was a part of the life of the church. While he was in the Sunday school, he was usually kept in a separate room with his personal assistant, and she did Sunday school with him. So no one, the whole point of this is no one knew him. And now he was a grown man. And that is what happens when our children grow into adults. The cute factor becomes, you know, something else. So what they wanted to do was have him not come to worship, because he made the other people nervous. Not because he did anything, but sit in the pew with his parents and he stared out. And I don't know him, so I don't know what the staring meant. But that's all he did. He was staring, and people who were in his line of sight became nervous. So some of the points of all three of these is how we are prepared for when people come. What is the attitude for welcome in our congregation? It's not just a few of us, but everyone has to know where they stand and what to expect. For our women who were in the group home, while the pastor and I'm not sure, I was not directly involved with that, but whoever it was from the church involved was just a handful of people. And while we did a training there, and while we did workshops, and while we did all the preparation work we tried to do, and the group home was next door to the church, so they could have gone and visited them at any time. The body of the congregation was not prepared. So when they had these not typical things happen, when they were not the customary things that people did when they came to church, they were beside themselves because it was too disruptive and they were not ready to let that go. So it's really critical for us to know that, to be ready for, or, you know, what if indeed someone in great joy does some unusual behavior? What do? We have to be ready as the church. And even if every single person doesn't believe it, you know, if I'm like stunned, the person next to me can say, we don't need to be stunned. This is okay. It's a congregational piece. Even with the young man, when the group home came to Friends, now I have to say our group had their own standards as well. And when they had the first noises and the first scream and the first wail, all the heads turned and there was shushing from Friends to Friends congregants. They were shushing the other congregants. But we just went with it, and the volunteers and leadership, we did not shush anyone. We just kept on going with the worship. And then at greeting time, we made sure that they were greeted by us. And then once that was set for our congregation, there was never another issue with their noises. They were welcomed, because at Friends to Friends, you're welcomed within an inch of your life. So they were always welcomed. Everyone made sure they said hello, and they became a vibrant part of the community. So us falling into our patterns in church isn't limited only to typical church. And while we had to worry about things like startle reflex or other things that sudden noises could create, none of that happened. And we just went along in our worship time, and people were able to learn and move ahead. Part of this is how we build good relationships and how we ease fears. How do we get to know people? Do we visit beforehand? I think Bill said that earlier. Do we visit beforehand? Are there ways that we can have the community involved not in their space? At Eastern Christian Children's Retreat, where I chaplain, when we start a connection with a community church or faith community, we invite them here, we have a tour, we invite them to assist with worship, and then they get comfortable with any number, the entire spectrum of everything. So when people come to the church, they really have some foundation of being ready. But how do we build those good relationships and ease those fears? What are the conversations we have about how people feel that they belong? And again, what are the boundaries that keep us all safe in a safe place? So how do we address the desire to participate and with appropriate communication? What do we do when someone wants to come up front and sing? What do we do when someone wants to read scripture who might not have the ability to read? What do we do when people want to participate in the life of the church? Do we provide them supports? Do we tell them absolutely not? How do we broaden the parameters of our sometimes desire for this perfect church experience, our perfect music, our perfect worship? And then in the end is creating the ability to guide. How do we guide people when they come in? And that's been referenced a couple of times. When anyone comes to our church, who welcomes them? Who points out the things to do? Who helps them find a seat? Who sits with them and explains the worship service? We don't want new people to come in and be feared. We don't want to be the church that tells people to move because that's my seat. when people are different, whatever their difference might be. How do we set that up before the person comes? Because the radical hospitality and welcome is being prepared for people before they even come to our door. And so those are just some thoughts I had on our own attitudes and preparations of congregations for being welcoming and living into a radical hospitality.
Just to kind of really echoing what some people have said, but in my experience, I see it's almost like I see an either or, and very few and in between of this swinging scale of how congregations and just people in general view these behaviors, these forms of communication. On the one hand, we aren't saying everything goes. In order to be welcoming, anything goes, behave however you please. But at the same time, I also see the very opposite, where people with intellectual developmental disabilities are looked at under a kind of proverbial microscope, if you will, with and I think Bill mentioned this, with just unrealistic expectations that don't hold true for anyone else. So an example of this is a gentleman worked really hard at making himself a cup of coffee and heating it up in the microwave and adding all of his sugar and cream and making it perfect. And he goes to take it back to his table and he spills it all over the floor, all over himself. And he was pissed. He was pissed and he yelled a curse word and slammed his fist on the table. And immediately the response was, that's not appropriate. We don't say those, like, those aren't appropriate words to say. We don't say those words. And my response was, he's a 65-year-old man. If he wants to curse because he spilled coffee all over the place, that might be an appropriate response. When was the last time any one of us spilled something all over the place that was not easy to, especially easy to pick up, and we had choice words come out of our mouths. And while this was an expression, clearly just an expression of his anger, but at the same time, the expectation was almost that of a child to, we don't say curse words. Well, you might not say curse words, but he does. So it, reminding people that he is an adult. If he chooses to use those words, he can. Now we might have a larger conversation of when you're in mixed company and that sort of thing. But the point of this was less of it in mixed company, and instead the idea was that he would just calmly redirect and be like, well, it's okay if I spilled coffee, and then go and clean up. And I don't know if anybody would have reacted that way. So there's this balance of, we don't want to go to the one extreme where we have these unrealistic expectations of expressing emotion. And while at the same time, we also there are clear boundaries to in belonging, into how we can relate to one another. And boundaries can actually be helpful. Some people, a lot of people with or without disabilities, we need boundaries to figure out what's okay, what's not okay, depending on the situation. They're good navigators. And so, but those boundaries can also be oppressive and restrictive. So finding that balance is quite frankly hard. And it's going to maybe be different from each person and situation, it's just in circumstance. But that's kind of the scale that we're kind of talking about, and hopefully those examples help. Now, at this time, I have invited as many attendees as possible to come into the panelist section. Those of you who have not, I don't know if you didn't see my invite, just don't want to have your video on, that's fine. If you do want to have your video on and be a part of the verbal conversation, please shoot your name in the chat and tell me so, and I will get you back onto the panelist. Otherwise, if anybody has questions, please either raise your virtual hand, your physical hand, or put your question in the chat.
I'm just reminded of so many stories over the years, and as I listen to you all, one of them being the dangerous situation we create when a whole group home comes together to a church. I mean, it's like you're taking a group, back at the first center where we did this, we had a great group of Catholic volunteers who came and used the center's buses and took 50 people to a parish on Sunday, with the volunteers kind of hovering around them. And I now look back on that and say, and I thought that was so great in those days. And I realized now we were going in mass to mass, and the kind of hovering of the volunteers to help everybody out kind of created a barrier. Nobody met anybody individually. We were in and out, and if it's a group home, you're coming with a group of people who may just be like a big family, continuing the arguments from the breakfast table, or the kind of pet peeves going on. And, so that challenges us to think about how do we connect people with people who could be their models or mentors or guides, and sit in different places and connect people around things that are interesting. And I think about a story I heard from a woman who was crystallized when people get really scared about some stuff, was about a man who had a fetish with women's shoes. And he used to like to say to people in the coffee hour, "Can I look at your shoes?" And it made the women uncomfortable there, of course. But the reason they were really uncomfortable was they were afraid if he got down to look at their shoes, he's looking up their skirt. And so these images of sexual predator or something like that kept flashing up. And what did you need in that? You didn't need a psychologist to come in and can't counsel this person in that situation. You needed a couple of guys his age to come over to him and say, "Hey, we don't do that here. We love you to be here, but come here, talk to us, and so on, and let's get you involved in some other stuff. But don't do that here. You don't see us doing that stuff here." So you learn from peers in that kind of way. So it ranges from things where people get really scared. I don't think I ever had anybody take their clothes off and run around, Joanne, like you did. But there have been other things with kind of sexual things that got acted out, and to think to other things that are also out of the normal that are really funny if people take the time to stop and look at it. One of those early mass to mass things I was sitting right behind Joanne, Florence, who was about 5 feet, and she was right behind me, and this particular priest was kind of uptight most of the time. He was German Catholic. He was fairly rigid. But this particular Sunday, he as he did the profession of faith and led us in that, he really put himself into it, and with a lot of feeling that usually hadn't been there. And he finished up with a flourish in the congregation. You could feel the ripple going on around the congregation, like, what's going on with Father this morning? And they're joining in. And right after he's finished, Florence stood right up and started clapping. My first thought was, "Florence, don't do anything that's going to threaten your acceptance here," which meant my acceptance here. And they invited me 3 weeks later to do the sermon, and I used that story at that mass and to say, think about it. If we put ourselves into our profession of faith heart, body, mind and soul with feeling. And if that was an expression of what we really try to be and do, we all ought to clap at the end of that, you know, and about that affirmation. So it's that balance of being able to try to take things and learn from them, but also help all of us learn. I still waiting for stories where I hear a congregation inviting people from a group home to come over and walk around the sanctuary and find out where the bathrooms and sit, you know, do a pretend service and have somebody guide you through what was going to happen at what time. As a Baptist missionary kid, I would have really appreciated that from a Catholic person, because the first time I went to some masses, I was very ecumenically challenged about what to do, when, where, and those kinds of things. So I think one of the important reasons about being open with this and talking with people and pulling people in to understand is we all have a lot to learn, and there can be wonderful moments of revelation, as well as helping people to feel like they're more participative in what's going on. So I'll be quiet for a minute, let some other people share some stories.
William Webb, you have a question?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Sarah. And this may be my own ignorance or naivete to pose it this way, because I have not been involved in this practice at all. But it seems to me like one of the things to think about is minimizing surprises for either the person who's coming to the congregation or the congregants. So maybe, and again, I don't know how this is handled by different congregations. So maybe some discussion with the staff who are closest to or the family members who are closest to the person with disabilities, you know, to be able to meet with a few of the congregants ahead of time and talk about, you know, get to meet the person and talk about, you know, what kinds of behaviors, what kinds of situations may trigger certain kinds of responses, that kind of thing. And also to have a discussion with the person about, you know, hey, here's how we operate at the service. Here's what you might expect when you come. These are things that might surprise you or it may not surprise you. But to try to, you know, I guess build the relationship way ahead of the actual, you know, visit to the congregation and develop the relationship there and an understanding of what things, you know, to expect from each other.
Thank you. I might respond to that first. I think you bring up some really good points, and if I'll kind of throw out some examples. If I am working with somebody who is shopping, faith community shopping, and we've kind of already talked about like where they might, like what their interests lies, where their theology lies, what they're looking for in a worship service, and what are their goals, and we find a place. I might set up an initial meet and greet between that individual, especially if it's a brand new place, between that individual and either a clergy or a congregant from that congregation, and then they can do like a walkthrough of the space. They can kind of tell them a little bit about what they have to offer, what they're, like you're saying, some of them maybe the expectations, and then that always kind of sets up some of the that expectation, those boundaries, those kind of the personality of the faith community, to then see if that's fitting to what they're looking for. As far as the staff and or individual with a disability meeting with the congregation to kind of share behaviors and triggers, I personally am not opposed to that, but I do think that there's a balance, because what I want to be cautious of is people to meet the behaviors and the triggers instead of meeting the actual individual, which then and Laura Lee Wright actually said this in the chat, you know, as you grow relationships, some of the behaviors might come out, but also I've also seen a huge difference between what staff may experience at home and what's on the quote behavior plan may never be seen in the faith community, because at home, that's a space where they might like push their boundaries, do a little power struggle, because it's their home, it's their comfort zone. Whereas in a faith community, they want to build relationships and it's their kind of happy place. And so sometimes the behaviors, one, are not as shown as often. But anyway, there is, I am not opposed to it, but I'm also very intentional with how much is shared in that conversation. I mean, an example of this is a woman who shares a lot of her life and personal things about her life because she wants to, she kind of overshares. And we have some things that we do at Stonebelt to kind of help her with oversharing, but the congregation doesn't really need to know that. They just need to be your friend. So yeah, there's kind of, it all depends on the individual and what I guess you're referring to. I hope that makes sense. Amy.
Yeah, I wanted to respond, and then I realized that we hadn't figured out exactly how to do that. So I'm going to follow everybody else. So I guess a couple of points. I want to echo everything that you said, Sarah. Also, I think if we're doing this right, I work a lot with adults who don't have family. They're maybe older and they're living with an intellectual and developmental disability in a host home. And we felt that we were doing church right when some of those people chose or heard about our church and just came. And they had the ability, some of them, to take a bus, and they heard about us and they showed up. And there wasn't an opportunity to do that kind of conversation. And I guess I also, echo with Sarah that we kind of want to have a chance to meet them, depending on their situation, right? But we want to have a chance for them to show themselves and be known. And then if something happens, then, you talk with them like you do with anyone else in a congregation. But I think the preparation that Joanne and some other people have talked about of the congregation before we do that makes that so much easier. If we can, for example, I teach mental health first aid to congregations and to agencies. And knowing just a little bit, educating ourselves a little bit about mental health and what those challenges might look like for somebody either in the congregation or coming in really helps everybody not have a reasonable perspective of what's happening and maybe how we can be present as the church or the synagogue or the mosque for that person. So I think it's kind of two ways. I think it's great to have those conversations when things come up, as you and Sarah were both talking about, and the idea of letting somebody come and get comfortable with the environment sounds great. When that can't happen, making a commitment as a faith community to be welcoming to different people by doing a little bit of work and articulating what our expectations are makes it easier for us to welcome people when they come in. And I did see something about the sensory environment in church settings, and I'm happy to talk about that later. But yes, churches can absolutely do that. And again, there are agencies like Sarah's agency. There are groups in your community that would probably love to help your faith community understand just a little bit more so you felt better and were clear about what it meant to offer belonging to people with neurodiversity. Thank you.
Joanne, you can go ahead. Are you going to comment on this one, or we do have that question in the chat as well?
Correct. I saw the question in the chat. I just wanted to concur and add on to the conversation about knowing, and just two quick points, which were kind of made, but when we do that and we meet with the staff or we meet with people beforehand, particularly staff, we get a more clinical, this is how we work with them where they live, whether it's in residence or, so, behaviors has a whole nother definition. And so I don't always know if you will get the information you're looking for in that way. That will be my only qualifier for that. And as a pastor of a congregation with over 100 people with every kind of ability and disability, and I choose just not to know. As the person, people grow into the community. We learn what we have, because in church they're not like at home. And that was another thing, back to the staff person. Let them grow into who they're going to be as a part of the church congregation. And our congregation is not above their own collective boundaries. And when we had a new group home come who were noisier, I had my own congregants turning around and shushing people and like, you can't be noisy. And again, because we rolled with it as the volunteers and staff, and we greeted them and welcomed them in, within a week or two, that no longer mattered. But I found it actually a funny irony that we have also then become so typical that when we had unexpected behavior, we reacted in exactly the same way. But I also had to worry then about the noise level and trigger factors for people who are startled, the startle reflex for people. So anyway, it can go either way, but sometimes just learning the person is more advantageous than getting too much information ahead of time.
Thank you. I do have some initial thoughts as far as the sensory thing, the sensory question. So the question specifically, let me try and find it. The question was, can you address sensory environment in church settings to mitigate negative behavior? So people do this in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's kind of like a sensory toolkit or a sensory bar on the side or outside of the worship space, or worship or sensory bags or whatever. Those are great. The best, in my opinion, kind of like in everything that we do, having that be available, but is making sure again that we're not directing people to that, as people have their own resources and tools for their behaviors to help with their anxiety or just needing to fidget, needing to move. So offering those is great. What we kind of want to almost stay away from is assigning that. Oh, you look nervous. Oh, you need to move. Why don't you go pick up a sensory item from the sensory bag or whatever. But offering it as an option, as we do want to trust the individual to use their tools or their techniques as they see fit, and not try and overgovern that. I hope that makes sense. Anything else? We are coming to a close. So at the end of this discussion, please feel free to continue to send your questions, and even after, I'll send up a follow-up email with some links, and you can respond to that with further questions, and between the four of us, we can start answering those. But also check out the other I'll share this one more time. Please be sure to check out our webinar series as we will go farther in depth on a lot of the things that we discussed in this seminar. Is there any last minute questions?
Oh yes, I would say I'm Rabbi Michael. I'm a chaplain and friends with the wonderful Reverend Joanne, and I appreciated you all very much. I think one of the most important things that you all said was how to treat the population with special needs, and speak to them as we would speak to any adult. And I know it's so important, and I know especially within the beauty of Judaism and Judeo-Christian, the beauty of loving your fellow human being and never doing anything to, God forbid, hurt a fellow person, that it's so important, because God forbid if people speak to them or talk down to them, that's so incredibly hurtful. So I really loved and appreciated what you all said about speaking to everyone, on an adult level, and everyone, within everyone's level and wonderful abilities. And I wish you all tremendous blessings from God. You're all doing God's work, and really truly beautiful love for one and all people, and beautiful caring and compassion. And it's so beautifully valuable and important. And I wish you all a much blessings and a blessed day.
Thank you very much, Michael.
100%.
I think one of the ways this issue permeates so much stuff is when you get into the argument about whether there should be special religious education programs or inclusive, meaning participate in the regular Sunday school or regular worship. And that the questions at the heart of that debate sometimes have to do with these kinds of issues that we were talking about today, about people, what we might call in a different context, acculturation, getting used to the culture of a congregation and a faith community. And it's why so many families who've had bad experiences in churches because of something, of the way their kids were treated or the family was treated, have said, I don't feel safe in, quote, a typical worship service. And so is there a place where we can go to worship as a family where we feel safer? And hence things like rejoicing spirits, or the no shush worship services that some or people, or the whole movement called messy worship in some parts of Christian faith communities in this country. And so one of the ways I always deal with it, it's not an either or. It's, there may be ways to do both and a couple of larger congregations I know that have one of those kind of more focused, participatory, anything can happen services along with other kinds of styles of worship they have in their congregation, a more traditional service, a modern, quote, service with a band, or contemporary worship or whatever. So you got offering various styles of worship in that. And one or two of those talks about their more participatory, inclusive service is something that starts attracting other people because a lot of people, because people are having fun. And so it's not an either or, but how can we help people to do both and help learn in both settings?
Well, thank you all for being here, and I hope to see you all at our next webinar, March 16th. Take care.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Be well, and shalom and peace, my friend.
Be well, Michael.
Thank you, my friend.
Belva, thanks for being here. Good luck next time. Raleigh, welcome from the Netherlands.